because it had to. Because St. Paul couldn't stay in the same place forever. So, or St. Peter or St. Thomas or whoever, all these ones who actually were spreading the church. So they had to kind of leave that structure behind. But then the idea was to keep forming, and this is how the church has arrived to us today, because other people continue with that role of one being formed, but then two forming others. Okay, so this is the end of my presentation. I don't know if you want to stop it here, Steve, or want to record the questions and answers.
Sure. I don't know. Do you guys want to have your questions and answers recorded, or would you rather stop them? I think it should be okay. Like,
Okay.
maybe anyone who's listening might have questions and stuff as well too.
So if you have ever any questions, and I'll see if I have answers from anything we just went through. So like I said, this is a very central truth to our faith. And this is something that's really been emphasised ever since the Second Vatican Council, the importance that every single one of us is called to holiness, every single one of us is called to be Christ. What I like a little bit about this presentation though is it's like a reminder that we're called not just to be Christ, but to help other people to be Christ as well. Because really, I've been understanding this more and more, it's like, if I'm really called to be Christ, then I'm called to help other people to follow Christ as well. Like St. Paul, I'm called to ask people to take that step themselves. Because Christ didn't just like walk around going, look at me, I'm so good, I'm fantastic. He goes, no, I want you to be formed to be Christ, and then I'm going to send you out to help other people. So, questions?
I think like that, I can definitely follow it. It was really, really clear talk explaining how you go through this process. But like when you're applying it in practice, how closely do you focus on adhering to the structure compared to say the more exploring the topics more fully that you're doing as the topic of your retreat topic or whatever? How, like, what's the balance between the sort of process of the script and the balance between the applying it to say how obscure you go with the topics, or do you try and keep it to central themes? Yeah, what's that mix?
This is a good question. It's like, say we've got a retreat this coming up next week actually, see I make all things new. So it's going to be very related to Christ in a sense. You can kind of connect it very well in that kind of go, look, we're in springtime. Spring is this idea of new life. So you want to connect it, for example, to what we were saying about the new self and the old self kind of thing. I think it's very related to you stripped off your old, you're having with your old self, and you put on a new self. So it's like you can really centre your theme about this. But I think, say this particular passage here is very related to both to be Christ as a whole, but also to the theme of see I make all things new.
So it's fine if you don't need to do the whole more detailed process bit. You can just
you wouldn't necessarily use
and then focus on your theme more rather than the process bit.
Yeah. So you probably wouldn't use this many passages.
No, okay, good. Yeah, I see what you mean.
People in very.
Thank you.
He gave like a big overview of this whole truth of faith. So when you're going to talk, obviously, you got to see how long you're going to talk for. If you're talking for 10 minutes to young people who won't listen for longer, obviously you just take one point, the most central point, and try and get that point across. Right? That their life is to imitate Jesus or something like that. Whereas if you're doing this at a more like an academic level, or you've got other people with you and you adapt it, you can go through all these points in far more detail and go deeper. So it does depend a lot on your audience, and then also where it fits in as well too. If you're doing this as a one-off talk, a one-off theme to the thing, you can go into a lot more deeper. You have to do an introduction. If you're doing it in a retreat, for example, where someone else has already talked about being love or something like that, you don't need to maybe do all the groundwork of the part of love being the motor of everything. So you can sort of not leave it out, but sort of refer that part to earlier, what they've already done, and then focus on the other parts that you're most interested to focus on in that part.
But you should still try and keep it to the principles of it, or the spine of it.
In general, because if you leave any of it out, you sort of miss that point. It's sort of you skip over points. So in general, that whole point of like what, why, how, what for, it's a good scheme to follow, because you sort of understand, okay, it's process, like you get them to understand the topic, why it's so important, how are you going to do something about it, and then what's it for, like what's it going to do in my life and apply it. So if you skip over that, like you sort of skip out of that part of the whole process of making it part of something that they're going to learn and live from a little bit. But you can also focus more on, if you see that the why is the most important part, like they've got this questioning about why they grasp the talk for the truth of the faith very quickly. You probably don't need to spend a lot of the time saying what it's all about. You can go more into this is why it's so important and focus more on that part, or the how, whatever you see is most important.
It's always nice to connect it back to the main theme that you're doing in the retreat as well.
Yeah.
So going, this is not something that's just out by itself, but it actually fits into what we're trying to do as a whole retreat. So say you've been to our retreats here where we normally do 2 talks. It's like we try and connect both those talks to that theme, but one generally tends to be a bit more ideal, and the other one maybe a little bit more projection or conversion. Probably both.
And you're allowed to share your PowerPoints.
Yeah.
That's okay. They're very good.
Well, Dan put that one together, so copyrights with Dan for that one.
All these photos are just pulled off the internet.
How much do you charge?
A lot. You have to make me lasagna.
Oh, that's easy. That's easy.
But this whole theme and like all the different points within it, it sort of has been developed by Urban Day over a long time. So it's all around the world, like many of us are learning this sort of same thing, the same structure,
Yeah,
the
I
same
like the
truth of
structure.
faith all around the world.
Yeah. Pictures are good.
Any other questions?
I think it got me the most. I don't know whether they think, but do you think it's possible to be a bit like St. Paul at the end? Like, would you guys be willing to stand up there and say, follow me as I follow Christ?
That's a biggie.
I wrote it down.
That's what you wrote down there? Yeah. What do you think?
Well, look, I actually think it's actually not really arrogant if you do that. It's really humbling if you would do that. I'm not sure. I definitely see faults in there, but part of me wants to say it, part of me doesn't. Do you know what I mean? I think the humble side of me would want to say that, but the kind of scared, kind of almost arrogant side wouldn't want to say that, because it's very extreme to say that, but that's what Christ is all about. So yeah.
I guess it depends who you're talking to and where you are.
Yeah.
You might find some people your age, if they're a youth, but will want to have that role model. You say that would think that would be really good, but if you're just out at a nightclub or something, I'm just an example at the pub, with a different might not be. Yeah, it just depends.
I guess it's, sorry, you're also saying follow me in the way I do things, so go to confession or admit my imperfections, or you're not saying follow me because I'm perfect, like Jesus.
Yeah.
You're saying that I'm like St. Paul, who admitted he wasn't perfect, but was aiming to be like Christ, and follow me in that, I think, in that struggle, in that journey, in that aim, versus I'm not Jesus.
Yeah, well,
So I'm not saying copy me,
this is
it's
the point
follow
you're
me
taking.
to him or follow me with me to him, and
It's a good
that's what I
distinction.
would,
Yeah. Because he
that's the
doesn't say,
humility in it.
he doesn't say just take me as your pattern. He doesn't just say imitate me.
Pattern of-
He says as I imitate Christ, as I take Christ for mine.
Yeah.
So it's like follow me in the measure that I'm following Christ.
Yeah.
And I think it does depend on people's backgrounds, their settings, and how they're comfortable talking. Like you do get some people who are quite happy to just pour it all out, and they'd say they would be quite relatable to many people. But on the other hand, you get very reserved people for whom, outlining all of their faults and failings and that in a social setting may just be too much. So I think you have to know yourself before you start off on that journey to know if it would be possible for you or not.
Now, I think I'm thinking of audience as well, like who, a bit with this, and thinking about, at Christ are actually at the moment.
Mhm.
Everything else is much more shiny and appealing, and it's that stage
Mhm.
still. So I'm just thinking about that, the process, but from a lower kind of
Baby steps.
level.
No, this is very adjustable. So a little bit like what we were talking about with Erica, it's like you adjust it to your audience and to your reaction. If you know that the people who are coming are on a totally different planet, you kind of have to present to them first the person of Jesus and why you think Jesus is so important. I think the whole process we were talking about right at the beginning, when we're talking about the ideal prediction and conversion, is really about so you actually present it coming from life and love. And this is the way that probably we should be coming through. It's like, what is life? What is life for? Why is love so important in our life? And then Christ shows us a love which is a bit different from the other loves that we experience. So when you come through that kind of process and pedagogy, people are kind of going, this Christ person, I want to know him a bit better. And then you kind of get into the to be Christ one would be more explaining a little bit about how Christ is the ideal for us then. But you have to go through the other, you think you can't kind of just jump over steps for people, especially who are coming in new. Whereas most of the people here, I could preach pretty much what I was preaching to be Christ and everyone would be fine with it.
Because you're normally already on board that, yes, you already know there's a God the Father, you're going towards eternal life. All these steps that you're talking about, yes, normally you've got a pretty decent base. So, yeah, if you're talking to people who are already practicing and wanting to find Jesus, you can start from that point. But in a retreat, for example, to use this as the first talk in a retreat is a bit hard because, well, unless you know that everyone coming to that retreat is already at a level of already accepted Jesus as their saviour, basically, and said that they're going to try and follow him and everything like that. So normally you've got to start with something that introduces them into Jesus first, and then once they get to know them and have a chance to pray with him and be convinced that they want to follow him, that's where this point makes sense. That, okay, now I am following Christ, and then you need to realise that only following him will actually make me who I'm really meant to be, and who the world really needs me to be as well too.
Yeah, the other point to that St. Paul approach is that it's also good for self-governance as well. I follow a sports writer who had a bit of a wayward life, and then he moved the cities he used to live in, and one of the first things he did was tell everyone that he was Christian, because he knew that by doing that he almost allows them to police his behaviour and say, well, I thought you were Christian, I thought you were Christian. So when you tell people like, hey, I'm Christian, it means you actually give them a bit of a license to call you out sometimes. So sometimes it actually is an act of humility as well to let people know so that they can hold you to a standard which you might not always be able to live up to for yourself. So it's almost like a positive.
They love pointing you as a Christian.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I did the same thing at work. I was telling people, and the guy who I told it, he told everyone, so I didn't have to tell anyone else. but then I remember every time after that I said like a joke, which is probably a bit inappropriate. Oh, you're a Christian. And you're going, no, this is actually good. It's actually helping me. Like you're saying, self-governance.
Yes. But also human, I guess, Christians.
Oh, we're all human, but I think this is why we were talking about before. It's like to present that we're sinners. We're not saying we're perfect just because I think part of our role as Christians, especially Christians living in the world, is to actually show people who Christians really are.
Yeah.
Sometimes people have an image of Christians as these perfect, holy people who are never put a foot wrong. And you go, no, I'm a Christian, and just because I put a foot wrong doesn't mean that I'm not a Christian, or vice versa. You give them a more realistic idea of what it is to follow Christ. It's not being this perfect, holier than thou person, but someone who has their own flaws but is trying to work through them and finds that their faith really helps them a lot with that work.
I guess a good example of that is kind of being a sponsor in a sponsors, are not the perfect, image of Christ. But to the people that they are sponsoring, they could be.
Yes.
It's just that person that I guess you can look up to that might know a little bit more than you, or might know Christ a little bit more than you do. So.
And someone who's going to give me a realistic idea of what it means to be a Christian as well.
Yes.
And it's
How
not always easy.
No, it's not
That's not
easy.
easy.
And how you can fit that into your life, or how you can make changes in your life to be able to do that.
Yeah. Sometimes people who they can ask questions of more comfortably rather than the priest.
Yes.
Can I bounce that idea? Because earlier on, I forgot your name, sorry.
Katrina.
No,
Philippa.
asked, because we were reflecting on the, I think it was the Ephesians passage where Paul was talking about how we should all reach the fullness of Christ. I don't think it's, and then you said that there is maybe small exceptions of certain people who've reached that fullness. But it made me think a lot the fullness of Christ, because Christ is an omniscient being, he's infinite. So I don't think you can ever reach that state of infinite, which I think is also the reason why he is the best role model. Because earlier when we explained all of these ambitions that we had as children to become a rock star, a politician, or a rich person, these are all finite things.
Yeah.
And these are things that we can acquire, and once we acquire it, we reach a plateau. Or pursuing something that's infinite, there's no plateau to it, so we're constantly pursuing something that is perfection. And I know St. Paul as well, I think, also in Ephesians, said that we should be striving for perfection, as opposed to we should be perfect. So I think there's this recurring theme of this never really finite experience of pursuing something that's infinite.
No, I think you're right. It's one of my realizations earlier on in my journey. I remember it was the most frustrating thing about Christianity is we never quite get there. And the best thing about Christianity is we never quite get there. Because it means you keep on having more journey to go. You're never there, but you keep on thinking, but there's still the satisfaction of the journey itself. I think that the fact that I'm a bit more perfect than I was before, yesterday, but I've still got more perfection to go. This is the most exciting life. Now the worst thing I used to find about reading a book was you get to the end of the book and you go, oh, that was a great book, but I finished. There's no more of this book left. I think this is one of the beautiful things about our faith.
So has anyone ever reached that fullness though, a finite person?
I don't think they have.
I'm pretty close. I've got another.
I'll be the judge of that.
I don't think I have. Even.
I was thinking of Saint Teresa, because she, up until I thought, something else would know better than me, up until her death was still wanting to confess or something, up until the very end of her life. And she's obviously stayed at a very young age.
Yeah.
I'm sure Mother Teresa wasn't.
No.
She.
There's another passage in St. Paul where he says, I'm still striving, I haven't reached the goal yet. I'm still striving, I'm still working hard to get to that goal. He said, but what I do is I fix my eyes on Christ and keep running. And I think this is our goal in life, is to keep on working and working. And I don't think we ever get there, but when we get to heaven is when the perfection, we encounter the true perfection. But the actual journey itself is part of the great beauty of our Christian faith.
That's why that reading is so important when we're talking about imitating Christ, is that he says, I know that I'm not perfect. He says it twice in that passage. And then he says, one thing I do, I forget the past and I look to the future. Jaime used to often say about married couples that married love isn't about looking into each other's eyes, but looking in the same direction. And it's the same thing with our following of Christ. And humility is the key to following Christ, which is why even for Jesus, his state was divine, but he didn't cling to his own equality with God, but he emptied himself and became like a slave. And so St. Paul talks about becoming the slave of everyone in order to gain someone for Christ. And I think that's where the washing of the feet and all of those parts of imitable parts, like if you're going to compete against someone, compete to become as humble as you possibly can. and to become the servant and slave as all, because he said, I didn't come in order to be first, I came in order to be the slave and to serve. In that, you can imitate Christ. And in humility, St. Teresa talked about the one whom Mother Teresa imitated was St. Teresa of Avila, and she speaks about humility as being walking in the truth. The truth is, I'm not yet there, but if I keep on walking and focusing on Christ, like in Hebrews it says, fix your eyes on Christ, then if we're looking in the same direction and not looking at each other at our faults and failings, we become companions on the same journey.
Very good. Any other questions?
Do you have any tips about putting together a bit of a talk? Well, we've got you here because we don't get you here very often.
Yeah, work from the known to the unknown. Work from the known to the unknown. If you're going to be starting, think of one of the experiences that has most helped you. Has it been God the Father? Has it been the fact that you feel that loving, like the calling of Jesus to love? If that's the place that you feel most called, start there. And it's like with the Gospels. How were the Gospels formed? They started with the Kerygma. The Kerygma was simply Christ died, he was buried in the tomb 3 days, he rose from the dead. And then all of the other was added on after that. In the talk, it's the same thing. Start with your Kerygma. How have you been touched? Like, I often talk about my experience in the train, right? You've heard it. I don't often explore the whole thing. I just mention it in most of the times when I'm speaking about it. But that moment at which I was captivated for Christ has become the kernel, the kerygma of my own conversion. Now, if for the whole process of forming the Gospels, they started with that little thing and then they worked outwards. I mean, they didn't start by writing the narratives of Jesus' birth. That was the last thing of all that was written in that Gospel. The first thing was, what has he done for us? And then from there, they started asking questions about how he got to that, what were the things that he said and all the rest of it. So I don't think you have to worry so much at the beginning about having a whole heap of things. But what I'd say to you, and the way that when I was in the Philippines, I'm a little bit rusty now because I was in the Philippines where I really did that, and I became the Administrator General, and I was forming disciples in accounting. Not very nice, okay? But when I was doing the Philippines, I would listen to the disciple. I'd say to them, what's the thing that most has touched you? If they said, the fact that God's my Father, fantastic. And then you start with that, and then you look let's look for a little example in your life that might be able to embellish that. Let's look for a little piece of scripture. If you start off with 3 or 4 minutes, you've got the kernel of the whole talk. One of the things with Jaime, I had such trouble trying to start to preach. But when I finally got one of the talks, Jaime said to me, right, if you get one of the talks, you get all the talks. Don't worry about the whole range of talks. But if there is an experience in one of those that has most captivated you, and it's in the talk, there's maybe 4 different points. Maybe the experience was one of those ones. Then just work around that. If you, with that little experience, you have a little truth of faith, whatever it was, that God is my Father. One of the readings that we have for today is, think of the love the Father has lavished upon us by calling us his children, for that is what we are. Maybe that's a little piece of scripture that goes with that one. So you can have this little thing you pull out, and you've got this little 3 or 4 minute blurb that you are certain of. Once you have that, work from the known to the unknown. Don't worry about all the facets that you don't understand. Start from the known and work from the unknown. And then explore, because from that one experience, we can help you to build the talk. If there's 4 different parts, and virtually every little part, if you like, is kind of like a truth about that faith. It might be a little example that goes with it. There might be something from theology that will back it up. And there might be something of an application to somebody's life. What we often do in our schools of apostles is we start off by giving the truth of faith, and then somebody gives an example of how to apply that, and then you might listen to something about St. Paul or St. Augustine or whatever, something you said, like your life is for love. The one that often is quoted is from St. Augustine, and you've made me for yourself, Lord, and the human heart is restless until it rests in you. Fantastic. Don't worry about the whole gamut. frightening. But if you start with what your little piece is, you can go from there. That's what I find. And I find that when people talk to me on a train or whatever, and they start asking about things, I always start from experience, because experience is non-threatening. If I say, as they say, how did you become a priest? I'm thinking, for this person, how do I explain this? Do I say, well, actually what I did was I went through 6 years of theology. I'm not going to say that. But I say to them, well, actually it began when I had this experience of Christ on a train of the Lord's statue. Really? How did that happen? Depending on how much time you have, you're not going to have 50 minutes. So you give the kernel, and then you start adding on from there. You know how, when we did information technology way back in the day when I was studying, you'd often leave hooks. You'd have an entry point, and you'd have little hooks that you then take up later on and explore in other different things. The talks are like that. So that when you're giving a topic, like for example, we're talking in 2 weeks' time about springtime. I'm not going to give the whole of everything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with something like, I'm going to think about the people. I'm thinking, so often we feel old, and people are yearning for something new to happen in their life. Okay? And it's not a question of new things, getting a new car, getting a new house, getting a new husband. No, that's not going to happen. Neither the car, maybe the car anyway. But what there is a new experience lived in it, in which I can experience, even though I'm in my same body, it's the same Greg, but I feel renewed today because I heard Jesus speak to me through the scriptures. I didn't hear it, a voice from heaven. I just listened to that scripture, and it's beautiful. It said, for example, St. Paul, it says, I know I'm not perfect. I think, yeah, I'm not perfect either. But what I'm doing is running a race, and so I forget the past. I think, wow, what a wonderful thing to forget the past and explore that. And say, do you know what it's like to forget the past? It's not just to forget the bad things, it's to forget the good things as well. Because you've got new things to accomplish, and so then you start exploring those things and what you're trying to say. And you can take off those little hooks and go through there. Like, for example, in one talk, if you think that the people really need to hear about forgetting the past because they've got this problem that's been with them for 30 years, then explore that. So you might have, as Father Neil was saying, you have all the points of the talk. You give them very briefly, but you explore number 3, or you explore number 2, or you explore number 4. So if I'm giving a talk to young teachers, as I often do, they ask me to go back to these retreats because they say that talk really captivated. They've got so much theology under their belts. They know so many things about their faith. But what they've never experienced, most of them, is that Christ is living. And he can actually touch your heart today. And they're so surprised by that. And I think it's wonderful. So you've got all the nuts and the bolts. Don't recreate the wheel. Try and work out where and this is the other thing about evangelization. My idea is this. I know everybody is searching for Christ. Christ is in the center. But some people are going from south to north. Other people are going from north to south. Other people are going from west to east, or east to west. I probably got it wrong, whatever I know. But the idea is that you give them the next little step, heading them towards where you think Christ is. So you don't want to drown the person. You don't want to give, if you've got a little baby, you're not going to give them like one of these huge steaks that Dan will cook for us, okay? But what you'll do is, you'll chew it up, and you'll, like a bird, you chew it and then you spit it into their mouth. And so you offer little teaspoonfuls, and I often talk about, we've got to offer teaspoonfuls of spirituality. And what's more, offer them something that tastes good, the sanitarian thing, it's not only food that, what is it, sanitarian, the food that not only is good, but it tastes, I don't know, I can't remember, it's an old, for those who are in my sort of class, that I'm going back now 50 years. But it's like the same thing about Christianity. And St. Peter actually says, give them reasons for your hope. And one of them, Dan will know which one it was, I think it was Evangelianity, it said, don't give them answers for questions they don't have. Yeah, don't give them answers for questions they don't have. It's ridiculous. So, I mean, they're probably not thinking about the fact that, there was, sometimes we got to think, this little child, what would fascinate this child is to know that you can always go back to experience and always go back to basic sort of things, but that I'm a priest because I experience Jesus speaking on a train to me. How did he speak to me on a train? Oh, that's the next thing. But if you lose them, they're gone. So you've got to try and give them something each time that they keep on following. It's kind of like yabby fishing. You've got to keep on, it's got to hang on to the thing. You've just got to pull it in gradually until the yabby comes close, and then you catch it. But if you do too much at one go, you drown it. And then I say, I'll talk about this another day. I've said enough. I'm just going to keep on going back to my little baptism doing. But remember, kids, keep it simple, stupid. Keep it simple. Because when it doesn't matter if you're giving a talk that's 45 minutes or if you're giving a talk which is 5 minutes. Even if the talks that are 45 minutes long, generally speaking, there are little sections in them. Each one of those sections, in order to keep the attention of the people, has to have something of, or for example, personal experience, or maybe a little bit of formation, like a bird, chewed up theology, or something, or what a saint said.
Or obviously the Word of God.
Yeah, exactly. Word of God as well. For ours, the central part is the Word of God. And associated with that, something in order to make it relevant to them. But again, if it's relevant to you, it's going to be relevant to them, because they'll see that you're captivated by it. And Mother Teresa, one of the things she says was that we have to catch people for Christ. So if they see that you're captivated, you're enthusiastic, they might not understand why, but they can see that something's happened for you to be captivated, and you've already got them in the door. What you do after that is what an apostle will do. Try and, again, Christ in the centre, where they're headed, give them a teaspoonful of spirituality, and then leave before they throw rocks. I'll do the same sort of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Bye. I want to be part of your school, by the way. I got to learn.
Every second Saturday.
We don't let everyone in. We'll have to see. We don't let everyone in.
Like, I'm going to stop the